Well, thanks very much for invitation and having the chance to give a speech here. I do it in a very traditional way by reading a paper. I hope I can with my eyes. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, the climate conference in Copenhagen was a total disappointment. This is the evaluation shared by all those who have been involved with climate change development for years. But why has this conference been perceived so negatively when such conferences often end with unsatisfying results? Some people say that Copenhagen is just another example of the failure of politics and the incompetence of politicians to agree on solutions to complex issues. One should rather rely on economics when it comes to the development of humankind. In my opinion, this is a fatal misunderstanding. We are not dealing with a typical political problem when it comes to climate issues. It comes down to the most fundamental question humanity can ask itself about their own survival on the only planet that can be inhabited. It is similar to the species question, which was raised 40 years ago with the emergence of ecological political thinking. The species question does not only constitute a problem concerning certain groups, classes, or individuals, it identifies a problem which concerns humanity in its entirety, the biological and social species which called itself Homo sapiens, sapiens meaning wise. Can this being that we have grown to be so fond of survive on Earth in the long term, or is it rather working persistently towards destroying its own conditions for survival? If it wants to live on, we must ask ourselves, in a political sense, what it must do in order to harmonize its way of living with the conditions given by nature and to harmonize inner and outer nature. How does a person produce, trade, consume? In short, reorganize their metabolism to be in tune with nature, thereby ensuring their means of existence forever. Just a short time ago, there were strong powers who wished to simply remove this issue from the table. Climate change was disclaimed. Scenarios of catastrophes were trivialized. At best, evasive measures that humanity could take if the Earth ever became too crowded were considered, maybe looking to the Moon, Mars, or other undiscovered planets. The time of such suppression on the issue is over. Nevertheless, no active solution seems to be within reach. But why is this? I think the main reason for not being able to find a satisfying solution lies in the interests of certain social groups and classes. It is known from sociological research into the behavior of individuals with regard to common welfare that most people, both abstractly and non-committally, follow an ethical norm which dictates that everyone is obliged to contribute to the composition of the local community. But everyone expects others to contribute first and also more, meanwhile hoping to benefit from the lower costs that this creates for himself. Whether this is a part of human nature or an influence from a highly stylized ideology of competition and rivalry may be judged by anthropologists. Such behavior will, however, certainly lead to downfall, be it sooner or later. Which interests and attitudes stand in the way of solving the species question? I see four major complexes: the self-exploiting interest of capital, the immediate life fears of the poorer groups, an unreasonable mass consciousness, and the operational problems of politics. Let's come to the capital. So, where is the responsibility of capital? Capital is, by definition, money that exploits itself. Money that's function is to increase itself by any means necessary. The self-exploiting process of capital is blind to the material side of economics. It is not interested in which material, energy, financial and human resources are involved, whether they are demanded in excess or even damaged. The only interest is for the numbers to look more and more promising and for capital to be accumulated. It is assumed that this process will bring prosperity to an increasing number of people. The dominating strategy in the study of economics as well as politics today is global economic growth, which sets a benchmark for progress and development. This is, however, questionable in light of the current environmental crisis. A global thinking in terms of growth is in principle incompatible with ecological thinking. Any strategy for growth will want to maximize the exploitation of materials, but political ecology wants to prevent that. The first basic principle of political ecology is that global growth cannot be the goal of economics. The assumption of economic growth being conducive to a higher quality of life is a false belief. The accumulation of growth does not only include productive and value-adding economic processes, but also the opposite, destruction and reconstruction. The production of carbon dioxide, for example, as well as the need to repair damages caused by carbon dioxide-induced catastrophes. Both comes to the gross product. The more catastrophes there are, the higher the estimation of growth. Such economic accounting is simply perverse mathematics. It is a similar situation in business administration. Competition forces businesses to develop strategies which often pay no regard to the environment in order to reach the targets of their own growth calculations. Many businesses are trying to be more sustainable and environmentally aware during production, but are limited due to the constant pressure of competing. Let's take a look to the automobile industry, for example. For a long time, it has refused to accept the necessity of manufacturing environmentally friendly cars. In league with the oil industry, they were leading the fight against climate protection. The more resources used, the higher the return. But now, under pressure from politicians and consumers, a competition for the reduction of CO2 and gas emissions has begun, which at first glance seems to be a move in a positive direction. Indeed, a green car is much better than a notorious polluter. But at the same time, less green cars would be better than more green cars. This demonstrates the business's dilemma. They have to think of an environmentally friendly alternative. However, what they can improve in terms of quality, they undo by increasing quantity. To be able to compete, they have to deliver as many cars as possible. Or even worse, when the market is saturated, they have to create a need to buy not only one, but the equivalent to 1 car and a half instead, SUVs for the city. An SUV might produce as little CO2 emissions and consume as few gas as possible, but the bigger mass it contains, the more energy it requires to work. The more costs there are in production, and it requires more energy to recycle than a smaller car would. This is without even considering the ecological costs of land use in congested cities. And what are we supposed to think of a company boasting with slogans of sustainability when its employees are free to pick any company car they want? The consequence is packs of fancy giants roaming the streets. To the labor and the poor. Let us now move from capital to labor and poor. To those who wake up each morning not knowing how they are going to feed their children that day, who do not know where they are going to find the money to pay the rent and heating bills, who worry about their income prospects, who may not have learned how to deal with more complex problems due to either lack of education or their own bigotry, who spend the whole day thinking about everything subject under the sun, but not about how he can relieve his pressures on environment. The poor strata only engage themselves in solving societal problems if it means their own difficulties are being addressed in the same process. This is the case on both a domestic and international level. In Copenhagen, we experienced how the developing countries demanded financial compensation from the developed countries for not destructively depleting their own resources as much as the industrialized countries did during their own periods of rapid growth. For years, industrialized countries have been using their own economic and consumer models as the archetype for industrialization countries. We now know, however, that if all countries followed the Western production and consumer models, then it wouldn't be long until the Earth was completely ecologically overburdened. It is therefore only fair for developing countries to demand that their renunciation of a similar lifestyle and a comparable way of production is rewarded by the industrialized nations, which up to this point have been wasteful with their resources. This is not just an ethical imperative and a question of justice, but rather an imperative of rationality and reasoning. Countries whose citizens fight for survival and have such immediate worries cannot accurately perceive future problems, let alone tackle them effectively. When the goal is to create a community of global economic responsibility, a negotiated balance of interests between North and South, including the policies of trade, finance and investment, is inevitable. However, it is also right that the elites of the Third World and the newly industrialized countries, which demand financial support from the North, are required to demonstrate good governance and transparency to the international community, showing that the provisions that are allocated to them are ecologically and responsibly used. Even in the Western industrialized societies, there are portions of the population whose own precarious situation is more pressing than rescuing the planet. This can even lead to a cynical attitude. If I don't have anything to eat, then all the others shall perish too. There can only be one conclusion drawn from this. The ecological question and the species question cannot be answered without a solution for social questions. Only when the poorer classes are relieved from the immediate difficulties in their lives can they have the opportunity to get involved in a common ecological policy. This requires not only smart intellectuals and enlightened scientists, but also a social majority and a mass consciousness which push for appropriate political decisions. To the mass consciousness. At the beginning of the ecological movement, activists were ridiculed and disdained. Whoever wanted to implement all ecological standards 100% were regarded almost as a type of medieval peasant. The Greens were shaggy tree huggers and were considered to be a small crazy subculture. Many isolated themselves from society and were seen as hillbillies. Besides, most people did not want to be permanently confronted by self-appointed saints who tried to make them aware of their own ecological deficiency. Whether this measure was qualified remains to be seen. It appears to me that if the majority of people improve by 50%, it is better than only a few people doing everything with 150% commitment. Today, a lot of things that once belonged to the ridiculed alternative lifestyle are now part of the high life lifestyle. This ranges from healthy muesli, natural cosmetics, biological food, and natural furniture to power yoga and feng shui. The behavior of individuals has to change. But the question is whether this will be a precondition or a consequence of ecological policy. There would be no use if I personally regulated the temperature of the air conditioning in my home to 22 degrees, when next door in the office tower it needs to be 18 degrees so that those in the business world can present themselves in suits and ties. Suits, the symbols of reliability and professionalism, are turning into the badge of irresponsibility when they provide as an excuse to be entitled to waste energy. Sorry. Most important resource is drinking water. The question of personal lifestyle needs to be addressed in a different way. If politics sets a new ecological framework for economics and moves away from the quantitative growth approach, also concerning people's own material goods and the maximization of consumption, this will have an impact on the lifestyle of individuals, the private as well as the publicly exhibited. The exception by society will change. Status symbols, which are still recognized as an indicator of success and position and which evolved from materialistic thinking, are increasingly considered ridiculous and bordering on antisocial. The consequences for one's own life would be to accept that cutbacks in insanely excessive consumerism and competitive swank must be made. This is not to advocate poverty ethics, in the same way that the overused saying, wealth for all, is hardly tenable. One's own feeling of prosperity and well-being will not dwindle as much if one follows the old ecological principle, small is beautiful, to use a new German term, downsizing. Getting a smaller model of car, turning the heating down to a minimum, use the off rather than standby setting, traveling with a train more rather than by plane or car, upgrading your mobile every 4 years rather than every 2 years won't kill us. In effect, we are parting from status symbols not as a consequence of renouncement ethics, but rather as necessary consequence of an ecologically aligned economy. Non-material values will replace material values. The overall concepts and ideologies also need to change. The materialistic thinking of neoliberalism has elevated the use of maximizing economic entity as an influential model. Value creation, making money and maximizing consumption is made from this device. Smugly and arrogantly, those who work on their human perfection are looked down upon. The very people who see themselves as the elite, those who with their selfishness almost brought the world economy to the edge of abyss, prove the perversion of the sets of standards in the so-called business culture that we have. When finally are such people be seen as elites and leaders who understand community as a community not of selfishness but of responsibility? We have to redefine the term of elite. So the policies. Policies have regulation problems. The big question is whether our parties, whether our leadership and whether the institutions which developed in a time of industrial and overall growth have the ability to organize a different kind of economic reforms. Whoever supposes that the policies must be further deregulated because the economy will sort itself out must be said that he deals with the problems from yesterday and the times before that. The future problems of an ecological dimension are only solvable by more investing in the policy-making process, more regulations and more international regimes. From a negotiation process, the various interest groups and societal layers need to agree on a common framework in order to avoid a situation in which politics has to suddenly enact an emergency law because environmental crises result in catastrophes, migration influxes, and armed conflict. It is necessary for today's society to inform itself on effective political compromises and mechanisms. I personally belong to the group of people who in the late 1980s suggested having a solitary environmental society treaty, discussed recently under the new title Green New Deal or Ecological New Deal. It concerns itself with a well-known difference of interests between the more affluent and less economically developed levels of our society. The social question needs to be answered. Since we cannot finance it by economic growth, for ecological reasons it is not desirable, it has to be financed by a hefty charge on the affluent people. There is no other way around this. Again, the question of redistribution, top to bottom redistribution, has arisen because a lump sum as a form of growth is not applicable as a solution. If the existential problems facing poor people are reduced, then collective ecological economies and consumers would make it possible that the quality of life as well as the physical existence as such also of the affluent people is granted. That's their benefit of the deal. You can't settle for a cheaper way when finding a solution for the question of the surviving of mankind. For years, we have experienced a boom in environmental technologies. Germany belongs to such leading forces and is not least supported by its export successes. However, environmental technology, which merely adds the growth ideology onto it, is not the long-term solution. Generating clean and renewable energy instead of using fossil fuels and atomic energy is an important political goal. A market has developed in this field, one which is growing. However, in this instance, growth is a consequence of appropriate policies, not by given economic benchmarks. At the same time, the market for fossil fuels as a source of energy should shrink, grows and shrinking. It is a question of political decision-making that provides the result as to whether the energy companies will have success in terms of their business goals. Somewhere, the quantity of energy needed by society finds its limits. It cannot be deferred by a growth strategy, because such growth finds its limits in the necessity to preserve other resources, such as agrarian areas, raw materials, drinking water. The limitation of growth, which the Club of Rome discovered almost 40 years ago, is still valid. Corporate strategies of postponing by predatory exploitation and waste in order to adorn their own numbers are the problem and not the solution. It is here that policies must set limitations. From all this, it seems to me that the terms of development and the development goals of economics need to be newly redefined. Quantitative growth as an end goal, demonstrated in the amount of gross domestic product and export quotas, is historically outdated. Growth policies will not solve all future problems anymore. To me, other indicators, such as the United Nations favored Initiative for Human Development, seem to be more meaningful. The northern industrialized countries are on hand, but the numbers don't correlate 100% with their economic strength. The USA, the country which by far has the highest amount of energy consumption per person, is incidentally in 13th place in human development. Energy consumption doesn't appear to be the key of having happiness. But the United Nations Index, however progressive it is, does not illustrate to what extent poverty is connected with the wealth of others or demonstrate the connection between quality of life and the quality of the environment. Thinking in growth categories does not meet with the need for future ecological protection. The stability and growth laws of the 1970s in West Germany, for example, created an equilibrium of growth, employment, neutralized debt, and interest rates. The environment played no role. In the neoclassical factor of production theory, a third category besides capital and work was considered, as it was arbitrary and a cheaply exploitable resource. Since then, the awareness that nature must also have its price has grown. But where's the economic theory that really makes room for an appropriate and systematic venue for these points? Trade with CO2 certification from the Kyoto Protocol tried at least. It also showed that the development concepts were not longer to be equalized with growth concepts. There is the possibility that socio-ecological economics will result in shrinkage. Growth or concentration may not be a presupposed goal. It needs to be the result of rationality from ecological reason, which incorporates social reason into itself. So let us say goodbye to the term of growth, and let us discuss about a new term of development. This is my proposal. Let us say we want to work collaboratively to adjust the opportunities and the quality of life to preferably high level amongst all people in the world while respecting the ecological capacity of our globe. This sort of development reflects the idea of ecological humanism. It takes into account the constraints of growth, the idea of an ecological social contract of society, as well as the national and international dimension. Even if it sounds abstract, this contract contains regulative ideas that can become directly political and practical basis. Even if the goals seem to be very ambitious, I'm afraid that if we do not move toward this direction, the species question cannot be answered. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Dr. Volmer. I think we still have time for a few questions,
Yes,
but
of course, if you like.
I just wanted to thank you very much for helping us to really understand better the historical framework that has led to the points where it was almost impossible for this Ecological New Deal, but also the concrete steps that can be taken by governments and as well as citizens to get us to the point where we can make it a reality. So I very much appreciate your reflections there. Maybe if my colleague could help me, we will pass the microphone around, I think, to the left first.
Hello, my name is Maureen Waters from the University of Lyon, and I was quite impressed when Mark introduced you because he mentioned, in fact, if I've understood correctly, that you have a background with 2 PhDs. Your first was in philosophy, and your second then was in economics and business.
No, sorry. I only have 1 PhD.
You only have 1 PhD, but you studied philosophy and
I studied philosophy for PhD, but I stopped these studies because I became member of parliament, and then 20 years later I did my PhD in politics, foreign policy.
Okay, but I was quite impressed, though, with the fact that you have the background in philosophy, and I wanted to ask you about education in particular, because I'm wondering now, after listening to your talk, if one of our primary problems in education is not the fact that so many degree programs, whether it be in business or in economics in particular, really does leave out the human side. And it's so disciplinary. So the fact when you talk about ecological humanism, this background in philosophy and this background in the humanities, I'm leaving your talk today thinking that if we really want to understand economics and business in the new century, we should really be studying philosophy to sort of have some of these perspectives and these inputs that have been left out in the economic theories. And if you could comment or say maybe a few words on that.
Thanks for the question. Of course, not everybody needs to study philosophy. It would be enough for me if in the universities also professors of economy would be accepted who not only reflect on the numbers of enterprises and companies and the GDP numbers, but when they also would reflect on the society as a whole. And I see, for example, in Germany, there are only very, very few scientists, professors who are able and willing to do so, because since about 20 years, only adherents of the neoliberalism get the good jobs. And so we don't have an open debate about the future of society in the economics in Germany. So you need not to study philosophy just, except when economical experts do more than talking about mathematics. Yes, please.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for this very interesting lecture. And my question would concern the relationship between as you say, the North and the South. You said earlier that developed countries should understand that they should not from the point of rationality, they should help and they should pay developing countries to make their mistakes again. And my question would concern that if we just think in those terms of helping in that way, that saying that we give you this kind of bribe, this money not to make our mistakes, but we won't really help them understand how these mistakes came up and how we should think about those things in a new way rather than just saying don't do that, then we don't change the dominant logic of communication between the two sides, and thus we don't really move forward.
Now, I think we made our mistakes and we try to learn from it. But in the same time, in the past, the industrialized countries tried to claim that their own way of development, that our way of living is the archetype, the model for all countries. And we have enforced the countries by many mechanisms to follow this model. For example, by the structural policy of World Bank or by the IMF policy. We used the debts of the indebted third world countries to enforce them to follow our understanding of development. And now they are on this way. And now we say we learned from our mistakes and we say you have to stop and go another way. If we do so, and I think we have to, then we only can do it in a form of partnership. Not the North teaches the South, but we make a round table, international negotiation process on an equal level, and then we will learn that they need some money at the moment they get, of course, but we also have to negotiate for which projects and in which way controlled this money should be given. There are some first approaches to do so, but I feel that is not enough. And the same, what I said about the international level, must be done on the national level between the different social classes.
Thank you very much for your insight. It's very refreshing to see that there is actually a different point of view about something. And as you said, you are, by doing this, already opening the debate even wider than it used to be. Our question, though, is about the archetype of living, or what is the ideal life, as many of us would say, is just merely a demonstration of power, a powerful attraction of certain countries to demonstrate a certain way of life for others to follow. So, whilst we are talking about ecological humanism, where we're just trying to change the conception of growth or progress, isn't it we should be focusing on the concept of power? Because if we could change the concept of power from actually attracting people to do something into power through unity, power through actual cooperation, isn't that would be the priority we should do? Because the thing is that by the end of the day, the whole system, the current status quo that we have, is actually determined by how we conceive power and how we act to achieve our conception of power. Thank you.
Well, I fear that you are absolutely right. These considerations seem to be very abstract and maybe philosophical, but if you try to turn them into reality, you very soon come to the power aspect. There are groups, persons, classes, whoever, who want to keep their power, and they have their power on the basis of the current system of producing and consuming. And when you want to alter this, to change this, to have an alternative system, you will be a challenge for all the people of the power at the moment. And that means you cannot do real, effective ecological policy without being aware that it is policy. It is not only technology. I I really appreciated the presentation of Professor Kempfert. I know her quite well. She is a very well-known person also in German TV who explains us the energy policy, the most progressive, I guess. But this is a technological approach. And if you talk with her about the consequences for policy, what does it mean about the balance of power in a society? She will give you the same answer like I do. It will change the balance of power in a society, and you have to be aware of this.
We have time for one more question.
Thank you for your very inspiring talk. It inspires actually to revisit the whole Western historical development from the Enlightenment to the French Revolution principles up to now. But I'm wondering, this is something that the Western world is going through with relation to the economic values that we have created. We also have a huge part of the world which is coming up with other values, and I'm referring to the Muslim world and Muslim business, Muslim finances, and partners that we sit with in negotiations tables that have different values. So how do we keep our development going? And I think it can only go in the direction that you are suggesting from the Western culture point of view. But I'm still wondering how you feel we can include the other part of the world. I'm sorry, I'm doing a polarity here, but...
Well, this is the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy. I guess this is the key. That's why I'm here, and I'm happy to be invited. Intercultural dialogue. I think this is one of the key resources, political resources we have. A lot of ideas how to live are coming from the Western style of life, not only American but also European way of life. And we exported them everywhere in the world, and we do so by different economic strategies. But there are different values who also make sense for their societies. For example, Muslim values, the so-called Asian values, coming from the Confucianism, which is partly the same like the Western, but there are also differences. And when I go to China or when I go to the Arabic world, I'm there quite often. You can talk with them about everything. You cannot shout against them publicly. You cannot stand here and attack them because of their policy in terms of human rights or lack of human rights. But when you go there and talk to them on face-to-face level, you can talk about everything. They do not want to be blamed publicly, but they see the lacks and the deficiencies in their own societies, and they want to develop and to learn, but they have their own rhythm, they have their own ideas, their own idea of development, and that does not mean to copy the West. And we have to understand this, that development does not mean to copy the West. Okay, thank you.